For thousands of years, the human body was a fortress, its internal mechanisms hidden behind a wall of skin and bone. To the physicians of antiquity, the Middle Ages, and the early modern era, the living patient was an opaque vessel. They could observe the exterior. They could examine the color of the eyes, the texture of the tongue, the pallor of the skin, or the swelling of a limb. They could collect and inspect urine, smell the breath, or taste the sweat. But the vital organs, the heart beating in its cage, the lungs inflating and deflating like bellows, the stomach churning, operated in a darkness that no human eye could penetrate while life remained. The only way to truly see the interior was to wait for death, when the anatomist's knife could finally peel back the layers to reveal the secrets that had ceased to matter. In the early 19th century, specifically in the year 1816, Paris stood as the undisputed capital of the medical world. It was a city of contradictions, where the Enlightenment's demand for scientific rigor clashed with the squalor of overcrowded charity hospitals. In these vast, dimly lit wards, doctors walked the rows of iron beds, frustrated by the limitations of their senses. They knew that disease was a physical thing, a lesion or a defect located somewhere inside the torso, but they had no way to locate it with precision. The body was a black box. The primary method for examining the chest at that time was known as immediate auscultation. The technique was as primitive as it was intimate. A physician would place his ear directly against the patient's chest or back to listen for the sounds of the heart and lungs. It was a practice fraught with difficulties. In the cacophony of a public hospital ward, the ambient noise often drowned out the subtle murmurs of a failing valve. There were profound issues of hygiene. A doctor might have to press his face against the unwashed skin of a laborer covered in sweat and grime, or risk contracting lice and vermin. Furthermore, there was the barrier of social propriety. For a male physician to rest his head upon the breast of a young female patient was considered awkward, if not scandalous, often leading to a hasty and superficial examination. And then there was the physical barrier of the body itself. If a patient was obese, the layers of adipose tissue acted as a sound damper, silencing the internal organs and leaving the doctor guessing in the dark. The wall of silence seemed insurmountable. Walking the corridors of the Necker Hospital in Paris was a physician named René Laennec. He was a man of slight stature, prone to asthma, intense and arguably melancholic. But Laennec possessed a dual nature that would prove crucial for the history of medicine. He was a doctor, but he was also a musician. He played the flute and had a deep, intuitive understanding of acoustics. He knew how sound traveled through air, how it resonated in wood, and how its timbre could change depending on the density of the material it passed through. One cool morning in September of 1816, Laennec was wrestling with a diagnostic problem. He was treating a young woman who presented with general symptoms of heart disease. However, her age and gender made the traditional method of immediate auscultation inappropriate, and her physical stoutness rendered percussion, the tapping of the chest with fingers, useless. Laennec found himself at an impasse. He knew the pathology was there, beating beneath the ribs, but he could not access it. Legend and history converge on a walk Laennec took through the courtyard of the Louvre, which was then a construction site. The air was filled with the dust of renovation. Amidst the debris, he observed two children playing on a pile of lumber. The game was simple physics in action. One child stood at one end of a long, wooden beam, scratching the surface with a pin. At the far end, the other child pressed his ear against the wood, listening with delight to the scratching sound that traveled the length of the beam with remarkable clarity, amplified and transmitted through the solid grain of the timber. It was a phenomenon known to any student of physics, yet in that moment, it struck Laennec with the force of a revelation. The solid wood conducted sound better than the air. He realized that the same principle could be applied to the human body. He did not need to place his ear against the chest. He needed a medium to bridge the gap. Hurrying back to the Necker Hospital, Laennec returned to the bedside of his young patient. He took a sheaf of papers, likely a medical notebook or a quire of heavy paper, and rolled it tightly into a rigid cylinder. He placed one end of this improvised tube against the woman's chest, directly over the heart, and pressed his own ear to the other end. The result was immediate and startling. The sounds of the heart were not merely audible, they were distinct, crisp, and amplified. The paper tube confined the sound waves, preventing them from dissipating into the surrounding air, and channeled them directly to the eardrum. The awkwardness of physical contact was eliminated. The hygiene barrier was established, but most importantly, the acoustic wall had been breached. Linek later wrote that he could hear the beating of the heart with a distinctness that was far superior to anything he had achieved with the naked ear. In the weeks and months that followed, Linek transformed from a physician into an engineer of sound. He knew that a roll of paper was merely a temporary solution. He began to experiment with materials, turning to the lathe to craft a permanent instrument. He tested ebony, cedar, and beech, seeking the wood that offered the perfect resonance. He carved a hollow wooden cylinder, approximately 1 foot in length and 1.5 inches in diameter, consisting of 3 detachable parts for portability. It was a simple, elegant tube, resembling a flute or a baton. He named his invention the stethoscope, deriving the term from the Greek word stethos, meaning chest, and scoping, meaning to look or to examine. The name was significant. It implied that through listening, the doctor was metaphorically looking into the chest. Linek spent the next 3 years conducting an exhaustive auditory survey of the human interior. He listened to the chests of hundreds of patients, correlating the sounds he heard in life with the anatomical findings he discovered during autopsies after they died. He began to map a new language of disease. He identified and named the specific sounds of pathology, the ralls, which sounded like rattling stones or bubbling water, the egophony, a bleating sound resembling a goat, the pectoriloquy, where the patient's voice resonated clearly through the chest wall. This was a fundamental shift in the practice of medicine. Before this moment, a diagnosis relied heavily on the patient's narrative, the story of their pain, their feelings, their history. The doctor was a listener of words. With the advent of the stethoscope, the doctor became a listener of the body itself. The patient's subjective experience began to take a backseat to the objective acoustic signs generated by their organs. The physician could now hear the valve that failed to close, the fluid filling the pleural cavity, or the cavity forming in the tubercular lung, regardless of what the patient said or felt. The publication of Linek's masterpiece, De Auscultation Mediate, in 1819, codified this new era. The book was sold with the wooden stethoscope included, a package that spread across Europe and eventually to the Americas. It was not accepted without resistance. Many older physicians mocked the device, preferring the direct contact of the ear or simply dismissing the need for such precision. They argued that it created a mechanical distance between healer and sufferer. Yet the utility of the device was undeniable. It allowed doctors to track the progression of tuberculosis, the great white plague of the era, long before external symptoms became catastrophic. The stethoscope became the defining symbol of the medical profession. It represented the power of science to perceive the invisible. It changed the physical stance of the doctor, who now stood or sat with a dignified posture, connected to the patient by a slender column of wood, focused intensely on the inner rhythm of life. However, despite the triumph of the stethoscope, a frustration remained. Linek had given doctors the ability to hear the machinery of the body, but they were still working in the dark. They could hear the storm raging inside, the wheeze of asthma, the murmur of the heart, but they could not see the clouds. They were like mechanics listening to an engine through a closed hood, able to diagnose a rattle or a knock, but unable to see the broken part. The body was no longer silent, but it remained visually impenetrable. The desire to see, to cast light into the caverns of the human form, became the next consuming obsession. Physicians began to wonder, if we can channel sound through a tube to the ear, Could we not channel light through a tube to the eye? Could we not find a way to peer down the throat, into the stomach, or through the pupil, and finally witness the living flesh in its natural state? The auditory breach had been made, and now the race began to illuminate the darkness that lay within natural cavities of the human frame. The wall of silence had fallen, but the veil of shadows remained to be lifted. The success of the stethoscope had fundamentally altered the sensory landscape of medicine. Doctors had learned to interpret the language of the body through the vibrations of air and wood, translating clicks, murmurs, and rattles into diagnoses. Yet, the human desire for sensory confirmation is dominated by sight. To hear a problem is to suspect it, to see it is to know it. As the 19th century progressed into its middle decades, the medical community became increasingly dissatisfied with merely listening to the internal workings of their patients. They wanted to look. The challenge, however, was physical and elementary. The interior of the body is dark. Unlike the chest, which generates its own sounds, the stomach, the bladder, and the throat do not generate their own light. To see inside, one had to introduce an external source of illumination into narrow, often winding passages, and simultaneously find a way to look back down that same path without blocking the light with one's own head. Early attempts were gruesome and perilous, often bordering on the barbaric. In the very early years of the century, a German physician named Philip Bazzini constructed a device he called the Lichtleiter, or light conductor. It was a cumbersome contraption shaped like a vase, containing a beeswax candle. Through a system of mirrors and rigid tubes, Bazzini attempted to project the flickering light of the candle into the urethra or the throat. While the physics were sound, the reality was impractical. The metal tubes were painful, the field of view was minuscule, and the heat from the candle posed a constant risk of burning the patient. The medical establishment dismissed Bazzini's invention as a toy, and he died ridiculed, his vision of endoscopic medicine unfulfilled. But the obsession with optics did not die with him. The 19th century was the golden age of physics, particularly in the study of light, lenses, and refraction. The crucial breakthrough came not from a desire to see the stomach, but from a need to understand the eye itself. For centuries, the pupil of the human eye was known simply as the black hole. When doctors looked into a patient's eye, they saw only their own reflection in the cornea or total darkness. They knew that behind the pupil lay the retina, the optic nerve, and the blood vessels that fed the brain, but the physics of reflection prevented them from seeing it. To look into the eye, one had to place a light in front of it, but to see the illuminated retina, one had to place one's own eye in the exact same line of sight, thereby blocking the light source. It was a paradox of geometry. Enter Hermann von Helmholtz. In 1851, Helmholtz was a young physiologist in Königsberg, Prussia. He was not merely a physician but a polymath with a deep grasp of mathematics and physics. He approached the problem of the eye not as a medical mystery, but as an optical puzzle. He realized that if he could direct light into the eye along the same axis as the observer's vision, the retina would light up. Helmholtz constructed a simple yet revolutionary instrument. He used several small plates of glass, angled precisely to act as a mirror. He placed a light source to the side of the patient. The glass plates reflected the light into the patient's eye, illuminating the retina. Crucially, because the glass was transparent, Helmholtz could look through the plates, directly along the path of the reflected light. When he first peered through his invention, which he named the ophthalmoscope, the black hole of the pupil vanished. In its place, he saw a vivid landscape of red and orange, the delicate branching of blood vessels, the optic disc, the macula. It was the first time a human being had ever seen the living central nervous system of another person. Helmholtz wrote to his father with characteristic understatement, saying that he had made a discovery that would be of some use to ophthalmologists, allowing them to see the background of the eye as clearly as they could see the nose on a face. The impact was seismic. Suddenly, doctors could diagnose glaucoma, hypertension, and diabetes by looking at the tiny vessels in the retina. The eye ceased to be a closed sphere and became a window into the systemic health of the body. This victory of light over darkness emboldened others. If the eye could be conquered, what of the throat? The larynx, the voice box containing the vocal cords, had always been hidden around the sharp bend of the tongue and the pharynx. Singers and doctors alike could only guess at the mechanics of voice production. The solution came from an unlikely source. Manuel Garcia was not a surgeon, but a singing teacher living in London. He was obsessed with understanding how his voice worked. In 1854, while strolling through the gardens of the Palais Royal in Paris, he caught sight of the sun glinting off a window pane. The flash of light gave him an idea. He rushed to a surgical instrument maker and bought a small dental mirror with a long handle. Garcia returned home and set up his experiment. He stood with his back to the sun, holding a large hand mirror in one hand and the small dental mirror in the other. He opened his mouth, placed the small mirror against his uvula at the back of his throat, and used the hand mirror to direct the sunlight onto the dental mirror. With a sudden gasp of realization and a suppressed gag reflex, he saw them. In the reflection of the small mirror illuminated by the sun were his own vocal cords. As he sang a scale, he watched the white bands of tissue vibrate, open, and close. He had performed the first successful laryngoscopy on himself. When he presented his findings to the Royal Society, the medical community was stunned. A singing teacher had succeeded where surgeons had failed, simply by understanding angles and persistence. These inventions, the ophthalmoscope and the laryngoscope, marked the beginning of a new era, the era of the speculum and the scope. Medicine began to fragment into specialties defined by the tools they used. The doctor who mastered the ophthalmoscope became the ophthalmologist. The one who mastered the mirrors of the throat became the laryngologist. The body was being mapped territory by territory, cavity by cavity. By the late 19th century, the rigid tube endoscopes had also evolved. Using improved lenses and brighter lamps, eventually moving from candles to gaslight, and then to the first primitive electric bulbs, doctors began to peer into the bladder, cystoscopy, and the esophagus. They could see tumors, stones, and inflammations in the hollow spaces of the body. Yet a profound limitation remained. All these instruments, the stethoscope, the ophthalmoscope, the laryngoscope, the rigid endoscope, relied on natural openings. They could only explore the body's existing tunnels. They could shine a light into the stomach, but they could not see the liver that lay beside it. They could look into the bladder, but the kidneys remained hidden deep in the back. They could see the vocal cords, but the lungs themselves were invisible. The human body was like a house where doctors could now peer through the windows and open the doors, illuminating the hallways and the rooms directly connected to the outside. But the walls themselves remained solid and opaque. The solid organs, the bones, the hidden masses of tissue, these were still inaccessible without the violence of surgery. If a patient had a broken bone, a tumor in the brain, or a bullet lodged in the muscle, the doctor could only guess its location by touch or by the patient's screams of pain. The medical gaze had advanced from the ear to the eye, from sound to reflected light. But light, by its very nature, reflects off surfaces. It cannot penetrate solids. To see the true architecture of the human frame, to see the skeleton hidden beneath the meat, medicine needed a force more powerful than visible light. It needed a ray that did not bounce off the skin, but passed right through it. The world waited for a new kind of vision, unaware that the answer lay not in the bright sun or the polished mirror, but in the invisible, mysterious emanations of a vacuum tube in a darkened laboratory. The age of reflection was ending. The age of transparency was about to begin. By the autumn of 1895, the map of the human body had been partially illuminated. Doctors could hear the heart through the wood of a stethoscope and peer into the throat and eye using mirrors and lenses. Yet, the great mass of the body, the skeleton, the deep organs, the projectiles of war or accidents embedded in flesh, remained hidden behind the opaque curtain of the skin. To see a bone, one had to break the skin. To find a bullet, one had to probe the wound blindly with metal instruments, often introducing fatal infections. The solid flesh was an absolute barrier, a boundary that seemed set by the laws of nature itself. In the quiet university town of Wurzburg, Germany, 50-year-old physicist Wilhelm Röntgen was not looking for a way to revolutionize medicine. He was interested in the behavior of cathode rays, streams of electrons discharged in vacuum tubes. It was pure, fundamental physics. His laboratory was a place of darkness and high voltage, filled with the hum of induction coils and the faint, eerie glow of glass tubes. On the afternoon of November 8, 1895, Röntgen was working alone. He had covered his cathode tube, a pear-shaped glass vessel known as a Crookes tube, with a thick jacket of black cardboard. He wanted to ensure that no visible light from the tube escaped to interfere with his observations. The room was sealed against the daylight. It was pitch black. Röntgen activated the coil. A high-voltage current crackled through the tube. Because of the black cardboard cover, the room should have remained in total darkness. But as Röntgen's eyes adjusted, he noticed a faint, shimmering green light flickering on a bench a few feet away. He stopped the current. The light vanished. He turned it on again. The green glow reappeared. He struck a match and saw that the source of the glow was a small screen painted with barium platinocyanide, a fluorescent chemical. This was strange. The cathode rays inside the tube were known to travel only a few centimeters in air. The screen was far beyond their reach, and the visible light from the tube was completely blocked by the cardboard. Something else was coming out of that tube, some unknown form of energy that could pass through black cardboard and travel across the room to excite the chemicals on the screen. Röntgen, a rigorous and cautious scientist, abandoned his original experiment and focused entirely on this phenomenon. He moved the screen further away. It still glowed. He placed a book between the tube and the screen. The rays passed through it. He tried wood, rubber, and playing cards. The rays penetrated them all, casting faint shadows only when the material was dense. He called them X-rays, using the mathematical symbol for the unknown. For weeks, Röntgen practically lived in his laboratory, eating his meals next to the humming coil, keeping his discovery a secret even from his assistants. He was mapping the properties of this invisible light. He discovered that lead stopped the rays completely. And then, he made the observation that would change the world. While holding a piece of lead in front of the tube to test its opacity, he looked at the glowing screen behind it. He saw the dark shadow of the lead, but he also saw something else. The faint, ghostly outline of his own fingers holding the metal, and within those fingers, the darker, distinct shadows of his own bones. He was seeing his own skeleton, alive and moving, projected onto a chemical screen. The flesh was transparent, the bone was opaque. On December 22nd, Röntgen brought his wife, Bertha, into the laboratory. He needed a permanent record of what he had seen, a proof that could not be dismissed as a hallucination. He replaced the fluorescent screen with a photographic plate. He asked Bertha to place her hand on the plate, directly in the path of the invisible beam. For 15 minutes, she held her hand still while the tube buzzed and the invisible rays bombarded her skin. When Röntgen developed the plate, the image that emerged was stark and shocking. It showed the bones of a human hand floating in a gray mist of soft tissue. On the ring finger, a large, dark mass hovered, her wedding ring, which had blocked the rays entirely. When Bertha looked at the photograph, she did not marvel at the science. She shuddered. In the 19th century, to see a skeleton was to see the remains of the dead. To see her own bones while she was still breathing was a violation of the natural order. "I have seen my death," she reportedly whispered. Röntgen published his paper on a new kind of rays just days later, attaching the photograph of Bertha's hand. The reaction was instantaneous and global. It was not just a scientific breakthrough, it was a cultural explosion. The image of the ghostly hand appeared on the front pages of newspapers from Vienna to New York. It captivated the Victorian imagination, which was already obsessed with spiritualism, ghosts, and the occult. Here was a machine that could photograph the invisible, that could see through walls and clothes. Within weeks, X-ray mania swept the world. The scientific application was immediate. Doctors realized they could now see broken bones without cutting, locate swallowed coins in children's stomachs, and find bullets in wounded soldiers. In military field hospitals, the X-ray machine became a miracle device, saving countless limbs from unnecessary amputation by allowing surgeons to see the exact fracture. But the public enthusiasm often outpaced the understanding of danger. X-ray machines appeared in carnivals and sideshows as novelties. Shoe stores installed fluoroscopes, machines that allowed customers to see the bones of their feet inside new shoes to check the fit. Children played with them for hours, fascinated by their wiggling skeletal toes. Wealthy socialites commissioned X-ray portraits of their hands to give as macabre keepsakes. There was a total lack of understanding regarding the biological effects of this high-energy radiation. Röntgen himself often worked without shielding. Early operators tested the strength of the beam by placing their own hands in front of it every morning. It would take years before the burns, the hair loss, and the cancers began to appear, revealing the double-edged nature of this new transparency. The ray that allowed doctors to see inside the body was also capable of destroying it. The discovery of X-rays marked the moment when medicine truly became visual. The body was no longer a black box. The doctor could now verify the diagnosis with a picture. The ambiguity of the stethoscope, "I think I hear a fracture," was replaced by the certainty of the radiograph, "I see the fracture." Yet the X-ray had a significant limitation. It was excellent at showing high-density structures like bone or metal, but it was poor at distinguishing between soft tissues. Muscles, tendons, ligaments, and organs all appeared as a similar gray fog. The heart was visible only as a shadow, a silhouette against the lungs. You could see its size, but you could not see its function. You could not see the rhythm of its beat or the electrical fire that drove it. The skeleton had been exposed, stripped of its mystery, but the engine of life, the beating heart, kept its secrets. It was a pump driven by an invisible force, a force that X-rays could not capture. To understand the heart, medicine would need to stop looking at shadows and start listening to the lightning that flowed through the veins. The quest for transparency shifted from the hard radiation of the physicist to the subtle currents of the physiologist. The body was not just a structure of bone, it was a machine of electricity. While Wilhelm Röntgen's rays were stripping the flesh from the bone to reveal the skeleton, a different kind of investigation was quietly unfolding, one that sought to capture not the structure of the body, but the spark that animated it. The heart, the central engine of human life, remained a physiological enigma. Physicians could hear its rhythm with a stethoscope and see its shadowy outline on an X-ray plate, but the force that drove it, the command signal that told the muscle when to contract, was invisible to both the eye and the camera. Since the late 18th century, scientists had suspected that electricity played a vital role in biology. Luigi Galvani had famously made frog legs twitch with a static charge, proving that animal electricity existed. By the late 19th century, it was understood that the human heartbeat was triggered by a tiny electrical impulse. This current rippled through the heart muscle, causing the chambers to squeeze and pump blood. If this electrical wave was chaotic or blocked, the heart failed. The problem was measurement. The electrical current generated by a human heart is infinitesimally small. To measure it, one would theoretically need to place electrodes directly on the heart muscle itself, an impossible task in a living patient. When measured from the surface of the skin, the signal was so weak it was drowned out by the electrical noise of other muscles and the resistance of the body. Early instruments like the capillary electrometer were sluggish and imprecise. They could detect that electricity was present, but they could not trace its precise shape or speed. They were like trying to sketch a galloping horse while looking through a foggy window. The blur was visible, but the motion was lost. Enter Willem Einthoven, a Dutch physiologist working at the University of Leiden at the turn of the 20th century. Einthoven was a man of obsessive precision, dissatisfied with the crude approximations of his time. He knew that to diagnose heart disease truly, he needed a device sensitive enough to react to the tiniest fluctuation of current, yet fast enough to capture the heartbeat in real time. He found his answer in physics, specifically in the telegraph technology used to send messages across oceans. He adapted a device known as the string galvanometer. The concept was elegant but mechanically demanding. Einthoven suspended a microscopic thread of quartz, coated in silver to conduct electricity, between the two poles of a massive, powerful electromagnet. The principle was simple. When the faint electrical current from the patient's heart passed through this silvered thread, the magnetic field caused the thread to move. If the current went one way, the thread bowed to the left. If it reversed, the thread bowed to the right. By shining a bright light on the thread and projecting its shadow onto moving photographic paper, Einthoven could record the exact dance of the heart's electricity. The machine he built in 1903 was a monster of the industrial age. It weighed 600 pounds, occupied 2 rooms, and required 5 people to operate. It was so sensitive that the vibrations of horse carriages on the cobblestones outside the laboratory distorted the readings. To dampen the noise, the laboratory tables had to be mounted on stone pillars sunk deep into the earth. Connecting the patient to this leviathan was a spectacle in itself. There were no small adhesive patches or gel pads. To make a sufficient electrical contact, the patient had to sit with both hands and one foot immersed in buckets of warm saline solution. Wires ran from these buckets to the giant machine. It looked less like a medical procedure and more like a bizarre galvanic ritual. Yet from this cumbersome setup emerged a thing of delicate beauty, the electrocardiogram, or ECG. Einthoven watched as the shadow of the quartz string traced a rhythmic line on the scrolling paper. He identified 5 distinct deflections in a single heartbeat, a repeating pattern of peaks and valleys. He named them with the mathematical letters P, Q, R, S, and T. The P wave showed the electrical firing of the atria, the upper chambers. The QRS complex, the sharp, tall spike, marked the powerful contraction of the ventricles, pumping blood to the body. The T wave showed the electrical recovery, the reset before the next beat. For the first time in history, a doctor could look at a piece of paper and see the function of the heart, not just its shape. A blocked artery didn't just cause pain, it changed the shape of the ST segment. An irregular rhythm wasn't just a skipped beat heard in the ear, it was a missing P wave or a chaotic scribble on the graph. The invisible current had been translated into a visible language. Einthoven's ambition went further. The machine was too large to move to the hospital, so he brought the hospital to the machine. He negotiated with the telephone company to lay a dedicated cable from the university hospital to his laboratory, a mile away. In 1905, he transmitted the first telecardiogram. A patient sat with their limbs in buckets in the hospital, and the signal traveled over the phone lines to be recorded by the giant magnet in the lab. It was the birth of telemedicine. The impact of the ECG was profound. It shifted the focus of diagnostics from anatomy to physiology. An X-ray showed the wreckage of a disease, the tumor, the fracture, the enlarged heart. But the ECG showed the process of the disease in real time. It revealed silent heart attacks that left no physical scar on the outside but devastated the electrical pathways on the inside. However, as the 20th century marched on, the world plunged into conflict. The First World War brought industrial slaughter, and with it, a desperate need for medical innovation. But it was the shadow of the Second World War and the battle for the seas that would inadvertently solve the next great puzzle of the human body. The ECG had wired the engine and X-rays had exposed the bone, but the soft tissues, the liver, the kidneys, the developing fetus in the womb remained ghosts in the machine. X-rays passed right through them, leaving only blurs. To see the soft, water-rich landscapes of the body, medicine would need to turn away from light and electricity and look towards the dark, crushing depths of the ocean. The technology designed to hunt steel sharks in the Atlantic was about to be turned inward, to hunt for life in the amniotic sea. As the 20th century descended into the chaos of the First World War, the world was preoccupied not with the mysteries of the human body, but with the terrors of the deep. In 1912, the RMS Titanic had struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic, a catastrophe that exposed the deadly invisibility of objects beneath the water's surface. In response, scientists scrambled to develop a technology that could see through the dark ocean using sound waves. The result was sonar, sound navigation, and ranging. By sending out a pulse of sound and listening for the echo as it bounced off a submerged object, a ship could map the invisible hazards ahead. The Second World War refined this technology into a weapon. Naval fleets used increasingly sophisticated sonar to hunt German U-boats prowling the Atlantic. The principle was simple. A ping was emitted, it hit the steel hull of a submarine, and the echo returned to the ship, revealing the enemy's location and distance. When the war ended in 1945, the world was left with a surplus of military technology and a generation of scientists looking for peaceful applications. One such man was Ian Donald, a visionary Scottish obstetrician working in Glasgow. Donald was a man of immense curiosity and practical bent, having served in the Royal Air Force. He was frustrated by the limitations of X-rays in his field. In obstetrics and gynecology, X-rays were dangerous. The ionizing radiation that made bones visible could cause genetic mutations in a developing fetus or induce cancer in the reproductive organs. Doctors could feel a mass in a woman's abdomen, but they often couldn't tell if it was a solid tumor, a fluid-filled cyst, or a pregnancy. They were blind until they operated, often performing unnecessary surgeries on women who were merely carrying a child. Donald knew of a device used in the shipyards of Glasgow called an industrial flaw detector. It used ultrasound, sound waves with a frequency higher than the human ear could hear, to check the steel plates of ships for internal cracks. If the sound wave hit a crack or an air pocket inside the metal, it bounced back earlier than expected, appearing as a blip on an oscilloscope screen. Donald wondered, if this machine could see a flaw in a steel plate, could it see a fibroid in a uterus? In 1955, he borrowed a flaw detector from a local boiler-making company. He began by testing it on a piece of steak he had bought from a butcher. The screen showed a jagged line of echoes corresponding to the layers of fat and muscle. Encouraged, he tested it on himself. But the turning point came when he examined a woman who had been diagnosed with inoperable stomach cancer. Her abdomen was distended, hard, and painful. The surgeons had given up. Donald applied a coating of olive oil to her skin to help the sound waves travel and pressed the metal probe against her belly. On the glowing green screen of the oscilloscope, he saw something unexpected. Instead of the chaotic echoes of a solid tumor, he saw a clear, dark space with sharp boundaries, the classic signature of fluid. It wasn't cancer. It was a massive ovarian cyst. He operated, removed the cyst, and the woman made a full recovery. This was the birth of medical ultrasound. Donald and his team of engineers, including Tom Brown, worked feverishly to refine the technology. They built the first compound scanner, a gantry that moved a transducer over the patient's abdomen, building up a two-dimensional picture from thousands of individual echoes. The patient had to be immersed in a water bath or have a water bag placed on their stomach to conduct the sound, reminiscent of Einthoven's buckets, but the results were revolutionary. The most profound impact was on the unborn. For the first time in human history, a doctor and a mother could look into the womb and see the living fetus without harm. The grainy, snowstorm images of the early 1960s were abstract to the untrained eye, but to Donald, they were masterpieces. He could see the head of the fetus, measure its growth, and even detect twins. The psychological shift was immense. Before ultrasound, the fetus was a hidden passenger, known only by the cessation of menstruation and the eventual quickening or movement felt by the mother. Now, it was a visible patient. Parents could see the heart beating, a tiny flicker on the screen, weeks before it could be heard with a stethoscope. The bond between parent and child began earlier, mediated by the glowing phosphorus of a monitor. Safety was the key. Ultrasound used non-ionizing mechanical waves. It was like shouting into a canyon and listening for the echo, but on a microscopic scale. It passed through fluid and soft tissue with ease, making it perfect for the water-filled world of the womb and the soft organs of the abdomen, the liver, the kidneys, the gallbladder. These were the very areas where X-rays failed. However, ultrasound had a major weakness. Sound waves are stopped dead by bone and air. The skull was an impenetrable fortress for ultrasound. The sound simply bounced off the hard bone, leaving the brain in shadow. The lungs, filled with air, scattered the waves, creating a chaotic fog. So by the 1960s, the medical world had a split vision. X-rays were perfect for bones and chest infections, but dangerous and poor at soft tissue. Ultrasound was perfect for the abdomen and pregnancy, but useless for the brain and lungs. And both technologies produced only two-dimensional images, flat shadows or slices. A doctor looking at an X-ray of a head saw a flattened skull where the front and back overlapped. They couldn't tell if a tumor was near the forehead or deep in the center. The brain, the most complex and vital organ of all, remained the most difficult to image. It was a soft, gray mass encased in a hard bone helmet. To see it, one still had to open the skull. The next leap required a way to see through the bone without removing it, and to see the soft brain without flattening it. It would require a marriage of X-rays and the newly emerging power of the digital computer. The solution would come not from a hospital, but from the music industry, from the same laboratory that brought the world the Beatles. The era of slicing the body into mathematical loaves was about to begin. By the late 1960s, the medical gaze had become sophisticated but spatially limited. An X-ray was essentially a shadow puppet show. A three-dimensional human being was flattened onto a two-dimensional sheet of film. In this compression, depth was lost. Ribs overlapped lungs, the heart obscured the spine, and a tumor hiding behind a dense bone became invisible. The doctor had to mentally reconstruct the patient's anatomy from these flat ghosts, guessing at the depth of a lesion. The brain was the ultimate challenge. Encased in the thick armor of the skull, the soft gray matter was almost impossible to image clearly. Standard X-rays showed only the bone. The brain itself appeared as a featureless blur. To diagnose a brain tumor, doctors often resorted to pneumoencephalography, a brutal procedure where air was pumped into the spinal canal to displace the fluid in the brain's ventricles, allowing them to show up on an X-ray. It was agonizing for the patient, akin to a torture method, causing blinding headaches and vomiting. The solution to the shadow problem came from an unlikely outsider. Godfrey Hounsfield was not a doctor, nor a biologist. He was an electrical engineer working for EMI, the British conglomerate famous for its music division and the Beatles. While the myth persists that the band's record sales directly funded the scanner, the reality was that EMI was a diverse technology giant, and Hounsfield was working in its central research laboratory. Hounsfield was a man of eccentric habits and intuitive genius. During a long walk in the countryside, he conceptualized a radical idea. If he couldn't see through the object clearly with one X-ray, why not take thousands? He imagined an X-ray source rotating around the patient, shooting narrow beams from every possible angle. On the opposite side, instead of a piece of film, a detector would measure exactly how much radiation passed through. This would generate a massive cloud of mathematical data, millions of absorption values. No human brain could process this, but a computer could. The computer would take these thousands of readings and calculate the density of every single point inside the slice. It would then reconstruct an image that looked as if the patient had been physically sliced in half, revealing the internal structure without overlapping shadows. He called it computerized transverse axial scanning, later shortened to CT or CAT scan. The metaphor often used was a loaf of bread. A standard X-ray looked at the loaf from the end, seeing only the crust. A CT scan pulled out a single slice from the middle, allowing you to see the raisins inside without breaking the loaf. Hounsfield built his first prototype on a lathe in the EMI workshops. It was a crude rig, intended to scan preserved specimens. He tested it on a cow's brain he had carried across London on the public bus in a kosher pickle jar. The scan took 9 days to capture the data and 2.5 hours for the computer to process the image. But when the printout emerged, the internal structures of the brain were visible. The leap to a human patient happened in October 1971 at Atkinson Morley's Hospital in London. The first patient was a middle-aged woman with a suspected brain cyst. The prototype machine was a claustrophobic, rattling contraption. The patient's head was inserted into a water-filled box to reduce interference, and the machine whirred around her for 20 minutes. The data was recorded on magnetic tape, which then had to be driven by car to the EMI computer center for processing. The doctors waited in agonizing suspense. When the image was finally generated, it was a revelation. There, clearly defined against the dark tissue of the brain, was a bright, circular mass, the cyst. They could see its exact size, its depth, and its location. The skull had been mathematically erased. The radiologist looking at the image famously exclaimed that it was like reading the headlines of a newspaper from across the room, and suddenly being handed a magnifying glass. The vague fog of the brain had resolved into crisp anatomy. In the United States, a South African physicist named Alan Cormack had independently developed the mathematics behind this process years earlier, though he had never built a machine. Both men would later share the Nobel Prize. The impact of the CT scan was immediate and total. It revolutionized neurology and trauma medicine. Suddenly, a doctor could see a blood clot in the brain of a stroke victim within minutes. They could see the extent of a cancer spreading through the lymph nodes. The scanner evolved rapidly. Scan times dropped from days to minutes, then to seconds. The water box was abandoned. The resolution improved from grainy blocks to photographic detail. The CT scan represented the triumph of computing power over biological complexity. It turned the body into a digital grid, a series of voxels, volumetric pixels that could be manipulated, rotated, and examined. However, the CT scan had its price. It was still based on X-rays. To get these detailed slices, the patient was bombarded with a much higher dose of radiation than a standard chest X-ray. It was excellent for seeing density, bone, blood, tumors, but it struggled with subtle differences in soft tissue. The gray matter and white matter of the brain looked very similar on a CT. A ligament looked much like a muscle. The Holy Grail remained elusive, a way to see the soft, water-rich interior of the body with the clarity of a photograph, but without the damaging radiation of X-rays. The answer lay not in external beams of radiation, but in the atoms of the body itself. The next revolution would not look at the body. It would make the body sing its own presence. It would require the most complex physics yet, a dance of magnetic fields and radio waves that would turn the patient into a transmitter. By the mid-70s, the diagnostic arsenal was formidable. The CT scan could slice the body into digital wafers, revealing the geography of bone and dense tumors. Yet for all its brilliance, the CT scanner was a blunt instrument when it came to the nuances of soft tissue. The brain's white and gray matter, the delicate cartilage of a knee, the intricate web of muscles, these appeared on a CT scan as muddled shades of gray. Furthermore, the reliance on ionizing radiation meant that every scan carried a small but cumulative biological cost. The final frontier was to achieve total transparency of the soft body without the violence of radiation. The solution emerged from the esoteric world of quantum physics and a phenomenon known as nuclear magnetic resonance, NMR. The premise is rooted in the atomic nature of the human being. We are, fundamentally, creatures of water. Our bodies are teeming with hydrogen atoms. The nucleus of a hydrogen atom is a single proton, and in the laws of quantum mechanics, this proton behaves like a tiny, spinning bar magnet. Under normal conditions, the billions of protons in a human body spin randomly, pointing in all directions. But physicists knew that if you placed these protons inside a massive, powerful magnetic field, they would snap to attention, aligning themselves with the magnetic north like soldiers on a parade ground. If you then hit them with a pulse of radio waves, a precise burst of energy, they would be knocked out of alignment. As they struggled to realign with the magnet, they would release that absorbed energy, emitting a faint radio signal of their own. In essence, the atoms could be made to sing, their location and identity. This was a laboratory curiosity for analyzing chemicals until the early 70s, when a race began to turn this physics into a picture. It was a race defined by brilliance, ego, and a bitter rivalry that would stain the history of the Nobel Prize. On one side was Raymond Damadian, an intense and driven physician-biophysicist in New York. Damadian made a crucial biological discovery. He found that the hydrogen atoms in cancer tissue took longer to relax, to return to alignment, than those in healthy tissue. He realized that this difference in timing could be used to detect tumors. In 1977, he built a machine he named Indomitable. It was a terrifying beast of a device, cobbled together with aluminum sheeting and chicken wire, leaking liquid helium. Damadian's assistant sat inside the magnet for nearly 5 hours while the machine painstakingly collected data, point by point. The resulting image was crude, a blurry, pixelated blob of a human chest, but it was the first MRI scan of a human being. It proved the concept. The body could be imaged by its own magnetic properties. Meanwhile, a chemist named Paul Lauterbur had a flash of insight while eating a hamburger at a diner in Pennsylvania. He realized that by adding gradients, smaller, varying magnetic fields, to the main magnet, he could spatially encode the signal. He could tell exactly where each singing proton was located in space, allowing him to build a coherent image much faster than Damadian's point-by-point method. Across the Atlantic, the British physicist Peter Mansfield developed the mathematical techniques to capture these signals at lightning speed, making the process practical for hospitals. The machine that emerged from this convergence, the magnetic resonance imaging scanner, or MRI, the word nuclear, was dropped to avoid scaring patients, was a triumph of engineering. It was a giant, donut-shaped tunnel containing a superconducting magnet cooled by liquid helium to near absolute zero. For the patient, the experience was, and remains, bizarre. They lay inside a narrow tube, surrounded by a magnetic field 30,000 times stronger than the Earth's. As the radio pulses hammered the atoms, the machine emitted loud, mechanical banging and clanking sounds, like a construction site in a tunnel. But the images were breathtaking. Where X-rays saw shadows and CT scans saw density, MRI saw chemistry. It could distinguish between a ligament and a tendon, between water and fat, between a benign cyst and a malignant tumor. It revealed the brain not as a gray fog, but as an intricate map of white matter tracks and deep nuclei, visible with photographic clarity. It could see the spinal cord floating in its fluid, the discs between the vertebrae, the meniscus in the knee. Crucially, it used no ionizing radiation. It was safe to use on children, on pregnant women with caution, and for repeated exams. The Nobel Committee eventually awarded the prize for MRI to Lauterbur and Mansfield, pointedly excluding Damadian. The controversy sparked full-page ads in newspapers and a storm of debate about who truly invented the technology. But while the scientists argued, the machine quietly revolutionized medicine. MRI completed the transparency of the human form. If the skeleton belonged to the X-ray and the abdomen to the ultrasound, The soft tissues and the central nervous system now belonged to the MRI. The body had been rendered completely see-through. Yet this was still a picture of anatomy, a map of the static territory. The final step was not just to see the brain, but to see the mind at work, to watch thoughts, memories, and emotions flicker across the neural landscape. The singing atoms were about to be taught a new song, the song of function. As the 20th century closed, the MRI evolved into functional MRI, fMRI. By detecting the tiny changes in blood flow that occur when a part of the brain is active, scientists could now see which areas lit up when a patient spoke, moved a finger, or felt fear. We were no longer just looking at the engine. We were watching the sparks fly in the combustion chamber. The journey from the wooden tube of Lineck to the superconducting coil of the MRI was complete. The wall of silence was gone. The darkness was banished. The body lay open, a transparent text waiting to be read. But in this total exposure, a new question arose. What happens to the patient when the doctor spends more time navigating the digital avatar than touching the human hand? The glass human was a miracle of science, but it cast a shadow of its own. We have arrived at the present moment, standing at the summit of 2 centuries of relentless innovation. The journey that began with a wooden tube pressed against a chest has culminated in a world where the human body is no longer a sanctuary of secrets, but a landscape of digital data. The opacity of the skin has been rendered irrelevant. Through the convergence of physics, engineering, and computing, we have created the glass human, being transparent to the medical gaze. Today, the technologies of the past do not merely coexist. They have merged into powerful hybrids. We no longer rely on a single mode of seeing. We have machines like the PET-CT, which fuse the anatomical precision of X-rays with the metabolic tracking of nuclear medicine. A doctor can look at a screen and see not just the tumor, the anatomy, but the hunger of the tumor cells as they devour glucose, the physiology. We can overlay the electrical map of the heart onto its magnetic image. We can navigate the blood vessels of the brain in 3 dimensions, flying through them like a pilot in a canyon, before a scalpel ever touches the skin. The digitalization of the body has reached its zenith in projects like the Visible Human. In the 1990s, the body of a condemned man was frozen and sliced into thousands of wafers, then photographed and reassembled in a computer. He became the first immortal digital cadaver, a reference library of anatomy available to any student with an internet connection. We can strip his skin, remove his muscles, and isolate his nervous system with a click of a mouse. Yet this triumph of transparency brings with it a profound philosophical paradox. In the 19th century, the doctor's primary tool was touch and the patient's narrative. The physician had to listen to the patient's story, to feel the heat of the fever, to smell the sickness. The diagnosis was a shared, intimate struggle in the dark. Today, the clinical gaze has become absolute, but it has also become distant. Walk into a modern hospital, and you will often see a strange choreography. The patient lies in the bed, while the team of doctors stands in a semicircle, not looking at the person, but gazing intently at the glowing monitors above the bed. The truth of the patient's condition is no longer found in their words or their eyes, but in the high-resolution images and scrolling numbers on the screen. The digital double, the MRI scan, the blood work, the genetic profile, has become more real to medicine than the suffering human being it represents. The body is transparent, but the person inside is perhaps more isolated than ever. We have traded the intimacy of the unknown for the clinical detachment of the known. And the horizon continues to shift. We are now entering the era of artificial intelligence. Algorithms, trained on millions of those digital slices we spent decades perfecting, are learning to see patterns invisible even to the most trained human eye. An AI can now look at a retinal scan and predict cardiovascular risk, or analyze a CT scan to find a nodule of cancer years before a radiologist would flag it. The scanner of the future may not just show us what is there, but what will be there. It will diagnose the ghost of a disease before it has even begun to haunt the patient. As we close this history, let us look back at the arc of our story. We started with René Laennec, rolling up a notebook to amplify the sound of a heart, desperate to bridge the gap between doctor and patient. We moved to the candlelight of early endoscopes, the eerie green glow of Röntgen's lab, the rhythmic scratching of Einthoven's needle, the sonar pings of the deep, and the singing atoms of the MRI. Each step was driven by a noble and desperate desire, the desire to heal. We sought transparency because opacity meant death. We wanted to see the broken bone to set it, to find the tumor to remove it, to see the child to save it. The technology is cold, but the impulse that created it is deeply human. We have turned the human body into a vessel of light. We have peeled back the layers of mystery until nothing remains but the biological fact. Yet, even as we stare into the high-definition map of our own neurons firing, the essential mystery of consciousness, the eye that feels the pain, the eye that hopes for a cure, remains invisible, floating somewhere in the ghost of the machine. The history of diagnostics is the story of our refusal to accept the darkness. We have built a world of glass, and in doing so, we have given ourselves the power to see ourselves as we truly are, fragile, complex, and miraculous machines. The wall of silence is down. The view is clear. The rest is up to us.